In an upscale psychiatric facility in New York, a shocking betrayal is about to backfire. Catherine Wells thought she had seen every kind of deception in her decades as a successful businesswoman, but nothing prepared her for this. Her own daughters, desperate for control of her $40 million estate, have orchestrated her wrongful commitment, counting on a system where every denial of insanity is viewed as proof of delusion. But they made one critical mistake. The mother they're trying to silence isn't just wealthy. She's brilliant, resilient, and has spent a lifetime outsmarting those who underestimated her. Now, as corrupt doctors and manipulated staff members circle around her, Catherine is quietly setting in motion a plan that will not only secure her freedom, but ensure her daughters learn the cost of their betrayal. They thought they could break her spirit behind these walls. Instead, they're about to discover just how dangerous their mother can be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 40 years ago, Catherine Wells stood in front of a dilapidated brownstone in Lower Manhattan, clutching a folder of carefully prepared documents and her last $500. The realtor had laughed when she made her first offer, but stopped laughing when she revealed the zoning law changes she'd uncovered. By the end of that day, she owned her first property. By the end of that year, she owned 3. Catherine learned early that knowledge was power. Growing up in a small apartment above her parents' struggling grocery store, she spent evenings watching her father pore over account books, trying to keep ahead of debt collectors. While other girls her age read fashion magazines, she studied business journals. When her high school counselor suggested secretarial school, she applied to business programs instead. She graduated top of her class, but no real estate firm would hire a woman as anything more than a receptionist. Fine, she'd build her own firm. She met James Wells at a property auction. He was the only one who didn't underestimate her, the only one who saw her sharp mind rather than just a pretty face. Together, they were unstoppable. James had the connections, and Catherine had the vision. They married 6 months later, and Wells Real Estate Development was born. Their daughters came later. Jennifer first, then Sarah 2 years after. Catherine tried to instill in them the same drive, the same hunger that had pushed her to succeed. Perhaps she pushed too hard. Jennifer went to law school, but seemed more interested in social climbing than actual law practice. Sarah became a doctor, but her lifestyle constantly outpaced her income. Both girls grew up watching their mother's relentless work ethic build an empire, but neither seemed to understand the sacrifice it required. Last month's Fisher Tower acquisition should have been her crowning achievement. The 50-story building had been the white whale of Manhattan real estate for decades. Catherine spent 3 years orchestrating its purchase, moving pieces into place with the precision of a chess grandmaster. The morning she closed the deal, she called her daughters to celebrate. Jennifer's response still rang in her ears. "Don't you think it's time to slow down, Mom? You're not getting any younger." That should have been her first warning. The signs were there, looking back. The whispered phone calls that stopped when she entered the room. The sudden interest in her medical directives and power of attorney. Paperwork. The concerned questions about her memory when she missed one lunch date due to a closing meeting. Even James, had he still been alive, would have seen it coming. But Catherine was focused on the future, on the next deal, the next acquisition. She didn't realize her greatest threat wasn't from competing developers or market downturns. It was from the very people she had spent her life trying to protect. That final board meeting last week, now she understood the strange glances, the tense atmosphere. She had just announced plans to expand into the Chicago market, a bold move that would require significant capital investment. Jennifer and Sarah sat in the back of the room, their faces unreadable. When Catherine outlined her 5-year vision for the company, Jennifer had smiled. Not her usual smile, but something else. Something that reminded Catherine of a predator sizing up its prey. Now, sitting in her sterile room at Oakwood Psychiatric Hospital, Catherine allowed herself a small, grim smile of her own. They thought they were so clever, using her drive and ambition against her. Paranoid delusions, the doctors wrote in their reports. Grandiose plans inconsistent with her age. They didn't realize that same drive, that same relentless determination would be their undoing. She hadn't spent 4 decades building an empire by giving up when the odds were against her. This was just another hostile takeover attempt, and Catherine Wells had never lost one of those. The photograph on Catherine's office desk was taken just 3 months ago at the annual Wells Family Foundation Gala. To outsiders, it painted the perfect picture. Catherine in the center, elegant in Chanel, flanked by her daughters. Jennifer, on the left, statuesque in her designer gown, every inch the successful attorney, with her perfectly styled blonde hair and calculated smile. Sarah, on the right, the spitting image of her late father, wearing the emerald necklace Catherine had given her for her medical school graduation. The photographer had captured them during a rare moment of genuine laughter. Catherine had just finished her speech about the Foundation's work in providing housing for domestic violence survivors, a cause close to her heart, when Sarah's champagne glass had slipped, nearly ruining Jennifer's $1,000 shoes. For a brief moment, they weren't power players in Manhattan's elite circles. They were just a mother and her daughters. If only she'd looked closer at the image. Behind Jennifer's laugh, there was a tightness around her eyes. Sarah's hand, resting on Catherine's shoulder, was gripping just a little too hard. The signs were there, like hairline cracks in a foundation. The real estate empire had always been a source of tension. Jennifer, as the eldest, expected to take control naturally. Her law degree, she believed, made her the obvious heir apparent. But Catherine saw how she handled her own small portfolio. All flash, no substance, caring more about appearing in the society pages than about cap rates and market analysis. Sarah, despite her medical career, constantly pushed for larger distributions from her trust fund. Her taste for luxury had already drained 3 separate emergency allocations this year alone. Their last real family dinner was 2 weeks ago at Catherine's penthouse overlooking Central Park. The housekeeper had served James's favorite pot roast, a tradition Catherine maintained even 5 years after his death. Jennifer arrived late, already typing on her phone before she sat down. "The Stevenson Group called again," Jennifer said, not looking up from her screen. "They're interested in discussing a merger." Catherine set down her fork. "We've been through this. Wells Real Estate stays independent." "Mom, be reasonable," Sarah chimed in, swirling her wine. "You can't keep going at this pace forever. The Stevensons would keep you on the board. You'd have time to actually enjoy life." "I enjoy my life just fine," Catherine replied. "This company is my life's work. I'm not ready to hand it over to people who would dismantle it for quick profits." "That's exactly the problem," Jennifer snapped, finally putting down her phone. "You're never ready. You'll never think anyone is good enough to take over. Meanwhile, Sarah and I have to sit back and watch you work yourself to death." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine looked at her daughters' faces she knew better than her own, and for the first time saw something that chilled her. Determination, calculation. Something hard and cold that reminded her of the worst corporate raiders she'd faced. "I have a board meeting next week," Catherine said carefully. "We can discuss the company's future direction then." "Of course, Mom." Sarah smiled, reaching for the wine bottle. "More wine? You seem tense." Catherine declined, suddenly, hyper-aware of every movement, every glance between her daughters. She'd spent decades reading people across negotiating tables, sensing when they were preparing to strike. Now, those same instincts were screaming at her in her own dining room. Later that night, after they'd left, she went to her home office to review some documents. A notification popped up on her computer. Someone had accessed the company's secure servers, looking at her personal files, medical records, and legal documents. The login belonged to Jennifer's legal team. Catherine sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She thought of James, of how he'd always told her she was too trusting when it came to family. Blood can be the sweetest poison, he used to say, usually after dealing with his own relatives' attempts to grab company shares. She began to move certain documents to more secure locations, but she was already too late. The machinery her daughters had set in motion was already grinding forward, powered by decades of resentment and greed. Within days, their plan would spring shut like a trap, and Catherine would learn exactly how far her own children would go to take what they believed should be theirs. The first concrete sign of trouble came in the form of a young intern's mistake. Catherine was reviewing the week's correspondence when she noticed a misrouted email. A psychological evaluation request for a high-profile patient with a familiar date of birth, her date of birth. The referring physician was Dr. Marcus at Oakwood Psychiatric Hospital. The email was copied to Sarah's personal account. Catherine's fingers hovered over her keyboard as years of business instinct kicked in. She didn't immediately confront or react. Instead, she began to dig. A quick check of Sarah's hospital credentials showed she'd transferred to a new department 3 weeks ago, geriatric psychiatric care. The same week, Jennifer had suddenly insisted on updating all of Catherine's healthcare proxies. Moving methodically, Catherine accessed the company's banking records. There it was, a series of large transfers from the corporate accounts to a new holding company, authorized by Jennifer using the power of attorney Catherine had granted her during a business trip to Dubai last year. The holding company's name caught her eye, Wells Family Trust Management. Her office phone buzzed. "Ms. Wells, your daughters are here for the 2 p.m. meeting." Catherine took a deep breath, straightened her jacket, and slipped on the mask she'd worn in 1,000 negotiations. "Send them in." Jennifer entered first, impeccable in a navy suit that Catherine recognized from their legal department's preferred tailor. Sarah followed, still in her hospital scrubs, a thick manila folder tucked under her arm. Their faces wore identical expressions of concerned determination. "Mom," Jennifer started, taking the lead as always, "we need to talk about some concerns that have been raised." "Concerns?" Catherine kept her voice neutral, her face composed. Inside, she was cataloguing every detail, the way Sarah's hand trembled slightly on the folder, the unusually formal way Jennifer had addressed her. "About your recent behavior," Sarah jumped in, her doctor voice in full effect. "The Chicago expansion plans, the erratic investment decisions, the paranoid accusations about account access." "Paranoid?" Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Is that your professional opinion, Dr. Wells, based on your 3 weeks in geriatric psychiatry?" Sarah flinched. Jennifer stepped forward, adopting her courtroom stance. "Mom, we're worried. Dr. Marcus is one of the city's top psychiatric specialists. He's agreed to do an evaluation, just a consultation, for our peace of mind." Catherine allowed the silence to stretch, another negotiating tactic she'd perfected over decades. She let her gaze drift to the manila folder in Sarah's hands, then to the family photo on her desk, and finally back to her daughters' faces. "Let me be very clear," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of every corporate battle she'd ever won. "I've spent 40 years building this company. I've outmaneuvered developers, survived market crashes, and beaten every opponent who thought they could take what's mine. If you think this is exactly what we're talking about," Jennifer interrupted, pulling out her phone. "These paranoid delusions about attacks and opponents. Mom, you're not well. We're trying to help." Catherine stood, using her height to full advantage. "Get out of my office, both of you, and take your concerns with you." "Mom, please." Sarah stepped forward, reaching out. "We can do this the easy way, for everyone's sake." "The easy way?" Catherine's laugh was cold. "You really are amateurs. Do you think you're the first people to try to take my company? To think you could outmaneuver me? I taught you everything. You know about strategy, but clearly not everything I know." She pressed a button on her desk phone. "Security, please escort my daughters out. And Linda, cancel their building access, effective immediately. All access." As security arrived, Jennifer's face hardened into something ugly and familiar. The same expression Catherine had seen on countless failed corporate raiders. "This isn't over, Mom. We're trying to help you, but you're forcing our hand." "No, Jennifer," Catherine replied calmly, turning to look out her window at the Manhattan skyline she'd helped shape. "I don't think you understand what's happening here at all." After they left, Catherine sat in her office until long after dark, methodically reviewing files, making calls, and moving assets. She'd learned long ago to always have a contingency plan. Now, as she prepared for the war her daughters had chosen to start, she felt a familiar calm settle over her. They thought they had the upper hand. They thought they knew all her moves. They were about to learn how wrong they were. 3 days of silence followed the office confrontation. Catherine used every minute wisely, working late into each night, making discreet calls to her most trusted associates. But she hadn't anticipated the speed and precision of her daughters. Next move. They had learned something from her after all, the art of striking when your opponent least expects it. The doorbell rang at 7:15 a.m. on a sunny Tuesday morning. Catherine was in her home office, already reviewing market reports. Through the security feed, she saw Sarah in her white doctor's coat, accompanied by 2 men in dark suits and a woman in nursing scrubs. Jennifer stood behind them, clutching a leather portfolio. "Miss Wells," her housekeeper called through the intercom. "Your daughters are here with some medical professionals. They say it's urgent." Catherine's hand moved to the panic button under her desk, the one connected directly to her private security team. But before she could press it, she heard the front door open. Maria, her housekeeper of 15 years, had let them in. They'd gotten to her, too. "Mom," Sarah's voice carried up the stairs, practiced concern dripping from every syllable. "We need to talk about your test results." Test results? Catherine hadn't taken any tests. She reached for her phone, but the screen was dead. The Wi-Fi indicator on her computer had also gone dark. They'd cut her communications. "Mrs. Wells," a deep voice, one of the men in suits, "we're here to help. Dr. Marcus sent us." Catherine stood, straightening her silk blouse. If this was how they wanted to play it, fine. She'd faced worse odds. She opened her office door to find them already in the hallway. "Breaking and entering is a crime," she said calmly. "So is falsifying medical records, which I assume is what's in that folder Jennifer's holding. You see?" Jennifer turned to the man who'd spoken, clearly a psychiatric nurse by his bearing. "Paranoid accusations, conspiracy theories. It's gotten worse." "Mrs. Wells," the female nurse stepped forward, hands raised placatingly. "We have documentation of concerning behavior. Your daughters have legal healthcare power of attorney. We just want to do an evaluation." Catherine's mind raced. The power of attorney. Jennifer must have altered it after the office confrontation. The original only activated if Catherine was incapacitated. Unless... "What did you do?" she asked Sarah, understanding dawning. "What did you slip into my coffee at that family dinner?" "Mum, you're not well." Sarah moved closer, reaching for her arm. "The paranoia, the conspiracy theories, the erratic business decisions, we're worried about you." Catherine jerked away, but the male nurses were already moving. Professional, practiced. They'd done this before. "Don't touch me," she commanded, using the same tone that had cowed board members and business rivals. "I'm calling my lawyer." "Your lawyer has been informed," Jennifer said smoothly, opening her portfolio. "We have all the necessary documentation. Dr. Marcus has already approved your admission to Oakwood for observation." The male nurse took Catherine's arm, grip firm, but not painful. The female nurse produced a small paper cup with 2 pills. "Just something to help you stay calm during." "Transport, Mrs. Wells," she said soothingly. Catherine looked at her daughters, these strangers wearing her children's faces. Sarah, who had her father's eyes but none of his integrity. Jennifer, perfect posture and pristine suit, already reaching for her phone to likely call the board. "Whatever you've planned," Catherine said quietly, letting them hear the steel in her voice. "Remember this moment. Remember that I gave you a chance to stop." "It's for your own good, Mom," Sarah said. And for a moment, Catherine thought she saw a flicker of doubt cross her youngest daughter's face. But then the pills were being pressed to her lips, and the nurses were moving with practiced efficiency, and Catherine felt the fight shift. This wasn't a boardroom battle. This was something else entirely. Fine. If they wanted to change the battlefield, she'd adapt. She'd built an empire by turning setbacks into opportunities. This would be no different. She took the pills, tucked them under her tongue when the nurse wasn't looking, and allowed herself to be led to the waiting car. Let them think they'd won this round. Let them think she was beaten. They'd learn soon enough what happened to people who underestimated Catherine. Wells, Oakwood Psychiatric Hospital's admission process was designed to strip away dignity. Catherine watched it happen with the same analytical eye she'd used to assess thousands of business operations. The efficient removal of personal belongings, the mandatory change into hospital-issued clothes, the practiced way the intake nurse asked questions designed to make any answer sound like a symptom. "How are you feeling about being here, Mrs. Wells?" "I'm being held against my will through fraudulent documents." The nurse made a note. "Persecutory delusions, common with your condition." They'd given her a private room. Her daughter's. Influence, no doubt. Through the window's wire-reinforced glass, she could see the manicured grounds that helped justify Oakwood's expensive price tag. A place where wealthy families could hide their inconvenient relatives. The room itself was a study in subtle control, everything bolted down, no sharp edges. A camera in the corner with its steady red light. Even the bathroom door had been designed to prevent barricading. Catherine sat on the bed, back straight, and began to catalogue everything she observed. The staff rotation patterns, the different sounds that marked medication times, the way certain patients were treated versus others. "Dinner time, Mrs. Wells." A young orderly appeared at her door. Nathan, according to his badge, mid-20s, tired eyes, wedding ring too expensive for his salary. "Would you like to join the others in the dining room?" Catherine stood, smoothing the shapeless hospital clothes with the same grace she'd use with a designer suit. "Thank you, Nathan. How long have you worked here?" "Oh, about 8 months," he answered, surprised by the normal conversation. "This way, please." The dining room was another exercise in controlled chaos. 20 patients at scattered tables, 3 exits, all staffed, a medication window where a nurse dispensed evening pills. Catherine noted which patients were alert, which were zombified by medication, which might be potential allies. "Mrs. Wells," a smooth voice interrupted her observations. "Dr. Marcus, the man who'd signed her commitment papers without ever meeting her. I'm glad to see you joining us. Social interaction is an important part of recovery." "Recovery from what exactly?" Catherine met his gaze steadily. "Since you diagnosed me without an examination," his smile never wavered. "Paranoid personality disorder with delusional features. Your daughters provided quite extensive documentation of your symptoms. The erratic business decisions, the accusations of conspiracy. You mean my refusal to hand over my company? You see, these persecutory thoughts," he made a note on his tablet, "will start you on a low dose of antipsychotics tomorrow. Help clear those thoughts." Catherine watched him move to the next patient, noting how he spent more time with those who had wealthy families. Another piece of information filed away. Back in her room that night, Catherine lay awake, listening to the rhythm of the hospital. Footsteps in the hall, night checks every 15 minutes, keys jingling, shift change at midnight, muffled crying from somewhere down the corridor. She thought of her daughters, probably already meeting with the board, presenting their story of their mother's sad mental decline. They'd be surprised when certain key documents couldn't be found, when certain accounts proved inaccessible. Small measures she'd managed in those last 3 days, but enough to buy time. A nurse appeared in her doorway with 2 pills. "Evening medication, Mrs. Wells." Catherine took them, pretended to swallow, and later flushed them away. She needed her mind clear. This was just another type of hostile takeover, and she'd survived dozens of those. The playing field was different, but the principles remained the same. Observe, analyze, find leverage, build alliances. Her daughters thought they'd locked away a helpless old woman. Instead, they'd given her nothing but time to plan their downfall. Catherine smiled in the darkness as she began to map out her strategy. The game was just beginning. By her third day at Oakwood, Catherine had mapped out the facility's power structure as meticulously as any corporate organization chart. Dr. Marcus sat at the top, his authority absolute within these walls. Below him, a hierarchy of nurses, orderlies and support staff, each with their own grievances, ambitions, and potential weaknesses to exploit. The patients, too, had their own social structure. Catherine watched it play out during group therapy, where Dr. Marcus's assistant, Dr. Reed, led discussions with all the enthusiasm of a fresh graduate. In the corner sat Thomas Henderson, former CEO of a tech company, now reduced to mumbling about stock options. Beside him, Rebecca Ashworth, who'd made the mistake of threatening to expose her family's art forgery scheme. Near the door, Diana Chen, who'd fought her siblings over their father's international shipping empire. A pattern emerged. Wealthy patients, family disputes, financial stakes. "Mrs. Wells?" Dr. Reed's voice cut through her observations. "Would you like to share your feelings about your situation?" Catherine smiled pleasantly. "I'm trying to understand it. Tell me, Dr. Reed, how many patients here have family conflicts over assets?" "We're not here to discuss other patients," Dr. Marcus cut in smoothly, appearing in the doorway. "Mrs. Wells, why don't we talk about your paranoid thoughts regarding your daughters?" "Paranoid thoughts?" Diana Chen spoke up suddenly. "They locked her up to steal her company, just like my brothers did with my father's shipping line." "Ms. Chen, remember our discussion about enabling others' delusions?" Dr. Marcus warned, but Catherine had already noted the flash of recognition in Diana's eyes. A potential ally. Later, in the common room, Catherine positioned herself near Nurse Taylor, a veteran staff member who'd been watching her with curious eyes. "Quite a collection of wealthy patients," Catherine remarked quietly as they watched Thomas Henderson argue with his reflection in the window. "More every month," Taylor replied, then caught herself. "I mean, we provide specialized care for all economic backgrounds." "Of course," Catherine nodded, "though I imagine some families find it convenient to have difficult relatives here, especially when inheritance or company control is involved." The nurse's slight flinch told Catherine everything. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. During afternoon recreation time, Catherine observed the medication distribution system. Nurse Wilson, young and obviously overworked, rushed through her rounds. Catherine noticed how she barely checked when patients pretended to swallow their pills. A security flaw noted and filed away. The day's mail delivery brought another revelation. A letter from her company's board of directors, already opened and read by staff. But Catherine wasn't interested in the letter. She was interested in the way Dr. Marcus personally handled all mail for certain patients, including her. "Your daughters send their love," he said, handing her the censored letter. "They're just trying to help you recover." "By seizing control of my company?" Catherine kept her voice mild, watching his reaction. "These persecutory delusions," he began his usual speech, "are remarkably common among your wealthy patients," she finished for him. "How convenient." That evening, Catherine received an unexpected visitor. Rebecca Ashworth caught her alone in the common room, speaking in urgent whispers. "I saw what you did in group today," Rebecca said. "You're mapping it out, aren't you? The system. I've been trying to document everything, but they keep confiscating my notes." "Tell me more," Catherine replied, maintaining a carefully blank expression for the benefit of the cameras. "There's a pattern. Wealthy families, sudden commitments, changed wills and corporate documents. But no one believes us because—" Rebecca gestured around the ward. "We're all supposed to be crazy." Catherine nodded slowly. Just as she suspected, Oakwood wasn't just a psychiatric hospital. It was a sophisticated system for legally separating wealthy people from their assets, and her daughters had handed her right to them. Later, lying in her bed during evening checks, Catherine allowed herself a grim smile. Dr. Marcus didn't realize it yet, but he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd put her in a room with Diana Chen, Rebecca Ashworth, and others who understood exactly what was happening. They weren't just patients, they were potential witnesses. And Catherine Wells had built her empire by recognizing opportunities others missed. The game was changing. Now she just needed to get proof to the right people. On the outside, the hospital provided notebooks for therapeutic journaling. Catherine requested 3, earning an approving nod from Dr. Reed. To the casual observer, she appeared to be a model patient, dutifully recording her thoughts and feelings. In reality, she was building a case. The first notebook contained exactly what they expected, carefully crafted entries about her confusion and growing awareness of her supposed condition. Dr. Marcus read these during their sessions, pleased with her apparent progress. The second notebook, hidden between the mattress and bed frame, documented everything she observed: staff schedules, security patterns, medication routines. The third notebook, the most crucial, was broken into sections for each patient's story. Each suspicious commitment, each piece of evidence of systematic fraud. Her breakthrough came during the weekly art therapy session. Nurse Lauren Hayes, recently hired and not yet hardened to the system, was supervising. "Your daughter's called again," Lauren mentioned, watching Catherine paint careful watercolor strokes. "They seem concerned about your business documents. Something about missing files?" Catherine kept her expression neutral, but inside she smiled. Her precautions had worked. The encrypted files she'd hidden before her commitment were still secure. "Files get misplaced sometimes," she replied mildly. "In a company as large as mine, it happens." Lauren hesitated, then spoke softer. "My father, he was committed to a place like this. My siblings did the same thing. Used his age against him, took his business. By the time I proved what happened, the damage was done." Catherine studied the young nurse carefully. Here was her opportunity, but one wrong move could destroy everything. "That must have been difficult for you." "It's why I took this job," Lauren admitted. "I thought I could help people. But here," she glanced round the room, then back at Catherine, "things aren't right here." Over the next hour, under the pretense of discussing art techniques, Catherine learned that Lauren had been collecting her own evidence. Missing patient records, suspicious prescription patterns, financial documents that disappeared from patient files. "I can help you," Catherine whispered, "but I need a secure way to communicate with the outside." Lauren's answer came the next day, hidden in the pages of a magazine during recreation time. A small burner phone, ancient and basic, but functional. "They don't scan for older models," Lauren explained during medication rounds. "Just be careful." That night, Catherine made her first call from inside her bathroom, water running to mask her voice. The number she dialed from memory connected her to Richard Chen, Diana's son, who had been fighting his uncle's takeover of the family business. "Mrs. Wells?" His voice was cautious. "Diana said you might call, that you understand what's happening." "I do," Catherine replied quietly, "and I have proof. Your mother isn't the only one. There's a pattern, Mr. Chen, a system. If we work together—" "I'm already building a case," he interrupted, "but I need evidence, documentation." "You'll have it, but first I need you to check something. My daughters filed new power of attorney documents. I need to know when they were notarized and by whom." She heard typing in the background. "Got it. Notarized by James Martinez 3 weeks ago. But that's interesting." "What?" "Martinez surrendered his license 2 months ago. These documents, they're fraudulent." Catherine smiled in the darkness of her bathroom, the first crack in her daughter's plan. "Mr. Chen, how would you like to help me expose not just your uncles, but an entire system of fraud? I have witnesses, documentation, and now proof of forged legal documents." "I'm listening." he said. After ending the call, Catherine carefully hid the phone and returned to her room. Through the window, she could see her daughter's car in the parking lot. Friday visiting hours were tomorrow. They would arrive perfectly groomed and concerned to check on their mother's progress. They had no idea that while they plotted in boardrooms, their mother was building a case that would shake Oakwood to its foundations. Catherine allowed herself a small smile as she smoothed her hospital-issued clothing. Tomorrow, she would play the role of the compliant patient once again, but now finally the real work could begin. Dr. Marcus's morning rounds were a masterclass in manipulation. Catherine watched from the common room as he moved from patient to patient, each interaction carefully calibrated. For Thomas Henderson, he was stern and authoritative. For Rebecca, Ashworth, paternal and concerned. For Diana Chen, professionally detached. Different masks for different marks. The real show began when hospital administrator Patricia Morton arrived for her monthly inspection. Catherine noted how Dr. Marcus's demeanor shifted, the subtle deference, the shared glances. Morton wasn't just an administrator, she was part of the scheme. "Mrs. Wells," Morton stopped at Catherine's table, where she was methodically solving a crossword puzzle. "I hope you're finding our facility comfortable. Your daughters speak very highly of Dr. Marcus's treatment plan." "Oh yes," Catherine replied, carefully fitting pieces of her performance together. "Everything's becoming so much clearer now." Morton smiled, satisfied, but Catherine caught the quick look that passed between her and Dr. Marcus. They weren't just colleagues. They were partners. Later that afternoon, Catherine observed a heated, whispered argument between Morton and Marcus in the hallway outside the staff room. Through the reflection in the window, she read Morton's lips. "The Chen lawsuit is gaining traction. We need to be careful." Dr. Marcus's response was equally revealing. "I've adjusted her medication. She won't be a credible witness." Catherine stored this exchange in her growing mental file. During her next secret phone call to Richard Chen, she learned more. Morton sat on the boards of 3 other private psychiatric facilities across the state, all with similar patterns of wealthy patients and disputed assets. The medication window provided another crucial insight. Nurse Wilson, rushing through her rounds as usual, let slip a paper from her cart, a special prescription list. Catherine glimpsed it briefly before another nurse snatched it away, but it was enough. Certain patients were receiving specialized cocktails, combinations designed not for treatment, but for compliance. "Your afternoon medication, Mrs. Wells." Dr. Marcus's new resident, Dr. Sarah Reed, approached with a paper cup. Young, eager, and completely unaware she was being used as a pawn. "Dr. Reed," Catherine took the cup, palming the pills as she'd learned to do. "How long have you worked with Dr. Marcus?" 3 months now. "He's brilliant. The way he handles." "In complex cases, like the Ashworth art collection dispute," Catherine probed gently, "or the Chen Shipping Company merger." Reed's enthusiasm faltered slightly. We don't discuss patient details." "Of course not," Catherine smiled, "though I imagine those cases make fascinating teaching examples, especially the timing of psychiatric emergencies coinciding with major business decisions." She watched the first seeds of doubt plant themselves in Reed's mind. Another potential ally, or at least another crack in the facade. That evening, during group therapy, Catherine paid special attention to the new admission, George Bradford, elderly oil magnate in the middle of a contentious merger. His nephew had signed the commitment papers, the same nephew who stood to gain control of the company. "This is ridiculous," Bradford protested during the session. "I'm perfectly sound of mind." "Agitation is common in the early stages," Dr. Marcus soothed, making notes. "We'll adjust your medication accordingly." Catherine caught Bradford's eye briefly, giving him the smallest of nods. Later, through Lauren, she passed him a note. "Don't take the blue pills. They're not for your health." A new piece of the puzzle emerged during evening medication rounds. The head pharmacist, Dr. Klein, was having an animated phone conversation. In his office, Catherine, pretending to be lost on her way back from the bathroom, overheard key phrases: premium rates, special handling, no questions asked. She added Klein to her mental organizational chart of the conspiracy. Marcus was the public face, Morton handled the administrative coverage, and Klein managed the chemical control of their prisoners. A perfect system for turning inconvenient relatives into compliant patients while their assets were stripped away. In her hidden notebook, Catherine began a new section: key players and leverage points. Under each name, she listed their roles, their vulnerabilities, and their pressure points. Dr. Marcus's expensive gambling habit uncovered through careful conversation with a loose-lipped orderly. Morton's previous involvement in a medical insurance scandal, discovered through Richard Chen's research. Klein's underwater mortgage and mounting debts. Every empire had its weak points. Catherine had built her fortune by finding them and applying pressure at exactly the right moment. Now, as she lay in her bed during evening checks, she refined her strategy. It wasn't enough to just escape. She needed to bring down the entire operation. The next day's paper, smuggled in by Lauren, carried an interesting headline: State Medical Board launches investigation into private psychiatric facilities. Catherine smiled. Richard Chen had made his first move. Now it was her turn to play her cards. Catherine's performance as the improving patient was worthy of an Oscar. Each therapy session became an opportunity to plant seeds of her counter-narrative. "I've been thinking about my daughter's concerns," she told Dr. Marcus, watching his satisfied smile. "Perhaps I have been too controlling of the company." "This is excellent progress," he noted in her file. "The medication seems to be helping with your paranoid tendencies." If only he knew she hadn't swallowed a single pill in 2 weeks. The real work happened in the quiet hours between rounds. Catherine had turned her bathroom into a command center during the dead time between 2 and 4 a.m., when the night staff was at their most lax. The burner phone from Lauren became her lifeline to the outside world. "The notary confession is secured," Richard Chen whispered through the phone one night. "He's willing to testify about who paid him to backdate the documents." "Excellent," Catherine replied, water running to mask her voice. "And the financial records?" "Better than we hoped. We've traced unusual payments from 3 different shell companies to offshore accounts, all linked to Morton and Marcus." Catherine's next move required perfect timing. During her weekly supervised call with her daughters, she dropped her first. "Bombshell, Jennifer, darling," she said sweetly, aware of Dr. Marcus listening in. "I've been thinking about the Chicago expansion. You'll need to check the subsidiary filing in the Cayman Islands. You did find those documents, didn't you?" She watched Jennifer's confident expression waver through the video screen. There were no Cayman Island documents, but her daughters wouldn't know that. They'd waste weeks searching for non-existent papers, giving Catherine more time. Through Lauren, Catherine had made contact with other key patients. Thomas Henderson's tech expertise proved invaluable. He'd memorized passwords to his company's security systems before being committed. Rebecca Ashworth's photographic memory for documents and dates helped build their timeline of fraud. Even Diana Chen's seemingly paranoid ramblings contained crucial details about offshore banking transactions. "Mrs. Wells?" Nurse Wilson appeared with the evening medication. "Time for your pills." Catherine took them with a grateful smile. Then, later documented another entry in her growing evidence file. "Wilson, Sandra, distributes non-prescribed medication combinations, witnessed 15 instances." The next morning brought an unexpected opportunity. Dr. Reed, the young resident whose doubts Catherine had been carefully nurturing, asked for a private consultation. "Some of these cases," Reed began hesitantly, "the timing seems odd. Psychiatric emergencies can happen at any time," Catherine offered innocently. "Yes, but always right before major business decisions and the medication protocols." Reed trailed off, conflict evident on her face. Catherine saw her chance. "You know, My late husband used to say that coincidences in business usually aren't coincidences at all. She watched the seed of doubt grow into something more substantial in Reed's eyes, another piece in place. Later that day, during art therapy, Catherine purposely painted a detailed landscape of a Cayman Islands beach. "My favorite vacation spot," she told her group cheerfully. "So many interesting banking opportunities there." She knew her daughters would hear about it through Dr. Marcus's reports, another breadcrumb in her false trail. Through the smuggled phone, she contacted her most trusted board member, Michael Chang. "The daughters are looking for non-existent documents," she whispered. "While they're distracted, start the internal audit. Focus on the last 3 weeks before my commitment." "Already on it," Chang replied. "They've made mistakes, Catherine. Sloppy ones." The pieces were falling into place. Each day, Catherine added more evidence to her hidden notebooks. Each therapy session became an opportunity to present herself as compliant while gathering more intelligence. Even her apparent confusion about business matters was carefully calculated to make her daughters overconfident. But her masterstroke came during family visiting hours. As Jennifer and Sarah sat across from her, radiating false concern, Catherine put on her best performance yet. "I've been thinking," she said, voice deliberately trembling. "Maybe you're right about the company. Maybe it's time to consider that merger offer." She watched their eyes light up with poorly concealed triumph. They thought they'd won. They didn't realize she was setting them up for an even bigger fall. Back in her room that night, Catherine added another entry to her secret notebook. Day 24. Daughters took merger bait. Expect contact with Stevenson Group within 48 hours. All pieces in position for phase 2. The game was progressing exactly as planned. Now she just had to wait for her opponents to make their next predictable move. Group therapy sessions had become Catherine's war room. Each patient around the circle was now a carefully cultivated asset, though Dr. Marcus remained oblivious to the resistance network forming under his nose. Thomas Henderson's seemingly random mumblings about security protocols contained coded messages. Rebecca Ashworth's artistic journal entries held encrypted records of staff movements. Even George Bradford's chess games with orderlies were opportunities to pass information. "Today, let's discuss trust," Dr. Marcus announced, settling into his usual chair. "Mrs. Wells, why don't you start? How are you feeling about your daughters?" Catherine allowed her eyes to water slightly, a trick she'd learned in countless boardroom negotiations. "I've been thinking about trust a lot, Doctor, about how we sometimes can't see betrayal coming, even from those closest to us." She watched his expression soften with satisfaction. Let him think she was talking about her daughters. She was really sending a message to Diana Chen, whose gaze had sharpened at the word betrayal, their prearranged signal that new evidence had been uncovered. Between sessions, Catherine had mapped every inch of Oakwood's social ecosystem. The janitorial staff who emptied trash bins containing supposedly shredded documents, the kitchen workers who could report which patients received special medication in their food, the maintenance man whose badge access provided insights into the facility's restricted areas. Lauren wasn't her only ally among the staff now. Young orderly Kevin, drowning in student debt, had begun documenting medication discrepancies after Catherine mentioned how whistleblowers in medical fraud cases often received substantial settlements. Night nurse Melissa, whose father had suffered a similar fate in another facility, regularly passed information about administrative meetings. The real breakthrough came during evening recreation time. Catherine sat at her usual table, methodically working on a jigsaw puzzle, while eavesdropping on a conversation between Dr. Klein and his assistant. "The audit team arrives next week," Klein hissed. "We need to clean up the prescription records." "There's too many," the assistant protested, "especially the special orders for Morton's patients." Catherine's fingers paused over a puzzle piece. Special orders. Another thread to pull. That night, during her secret phone call with Richard Chen, she laid out her discovery. Check the pharmacy records. Look for patterns in prescription orders matching dates of asset transfers. Already found something interesting, Chen replied. Every time a patient's financial documents are modified, there's a corresponding change in their medication protocol. They're literally drugging people to prevent them from fighting back during asset transfers. Catherine smiled in the darkness. And Dr. Reed is starting to notice. She asked questions about the medication schedules today. Can we trust her? Not yet, but soon. She has a strong moral compass, and more importantly, a desire to protect her medical license. The next morning, Catherine put the next phase of her plan into action. During art therapy, she deliberately had a breakthrough moment. I understand now, she announced loud enough for other patients to hear. My daughters were right. I was becoming paranoid about the company. These medications, they're helping me see things clearly. Dr. Marcus practically glowed with satisfaction. Later that day, Catherine overheard him on the phone with Jennifer. Remarkable progress. Medication finally taking effect. Might be ready to discuss business matters soon. Perfect. Let them think the medications were working. Let them believe she was becoming compliant. It would make their eventual downfall even more complete. During afternoon recreation, Catherine orchestrated her masterpiece of manipulation. She arranged a group activity, painting therapy, that brought together key players in seemingly random interactions. Thomas Henderson accidentally spilled paint on Dr. Klein's reports. Rebecca Ashworth's dramatic reaction created enough chaos for Diana Chen to photograph documents with a tiny camera hidden in her watch. George Bradford's loud complaints about the mess kept staff distracted. By evening, they had evidence of falsified prescription records spanning 3 years. Her bathroom command center that night, Catherine updated her growing case file. The pieces were almost in place. Her daughters had taken the merger bait. Dr. Marcus was convinced his treatment was working, and Morton was about to walk into a trap of her own making. The state medical board investigator arrives Monday, Richard. Chen informed her during their nightly call. Anonymous tip about prescription fraud. They'll want to interview patients. Catherine ended the call and smiled at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Soon, very soon, she would spring the trap that would not only free her, but bring down an entire network of corruption. Let them think she was just another wealthy old woman they could drug into submission. They'd learned too late that they'd locked themselves in with a predator, not prey. The smuggled financial documents arrived through an elaborate chain of custody, from Michael Chang to Richard Chen, through Lauren's nursing textbook, and finally to Catherine's hands during evening medication rounds. As she sat in her bathroom, sanctuary at 3 a.m., poring over the papers under the dim light, the full scope of her daughter's betrayal took her breath away. They hadn't just planned to take her company. They'd been systematically looting it for months. Hidden transfers, falsified board minutes, backdated resignations. Jennifer had used her legal expertise to create a maze of shell companies, while Sarah's medical credentials had paved the way for the fraudulent commitment papers. But something else caught Catherine's attention. Buried in the transaction records were payments to familiar names: Morton, Marcus, Klein. Her daughters weren't just clients of Oakwood's corrupt system, they were investors in it. The rabbit hole goes deeper, Catherine whispered into the burner phone later that night. Check the incorporation papers for Oakwood's parent company. Look for a shell corporation called Artemis Health Partners. Already on it, Richard Chen replied. Your daughters own 15% through offshore accounts. They've been helping Morton and Marcus lock up wealthy patients for a cut of the profits for the past 2 years. The revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. This wasn't just about her company. Her own daughters were actively participating in imprisoning other people for profit. How many families had they helped destroy? How many lives had they ruined? During morning group therapy, Catherine studied her fellow patients with new eyes. Thomas Henderson's company had been considering a merger that would have exposed questionable accounting practices. Rebecca Ashworth had been about to hire forensic experts to examine her family's art collection. Diana Chen had uncovered evidence of money laundering in her family's shipping business. Mrs. Wells, Dr. Marcus interrupted her thoughts. "You seem distracted today." "Just thinking about family," Catherine replied smoothly. "About trust and betrayal." She caught Dr. Reed's sharp glance. The young resident was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the patterns she was noticing. Time to push her closer to the breaking point. That afternoon, Catherine engineered a seemingly casual conversation with Reed during art therapy. "Doctor, have you ever noticed how many patients here have financial disputes with their families?" "I try not to discuss other patients' cases," Reed replied, but her hesitation was telling. "Of course not," Catherine smiled benignly, "though I imagine the State Medical Board might find certain patterns interesting, especially given recent legislation about medical fraud and financial exploitation." She watched Reed's face pale slightly before the young doctor hurried away. Another seed planted. Through Lauren, Catherine received more damning evidence. Copies of emails between Jennifer and Morton discussing investment opportunities in other private psychiatric facilities. Sarah's signature on admission papers for 3 other wealthy patients, each coinciding with major business decisions. A pattern of corruption that stretched across state lines. Catherine documented everything in her hidden notebooks, building a case that would not only free her, but bring down an entire criminal enterprise. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. During evening recreation, George Bradford pulled her aside during a chess game. "Catherine," he whispered, moving his knight, "I remembered something. Before they brought me here, I overheard my nephew on the phone with someone named Jennifer Wells. They were discussing something called Protocol Artemis." Catherine's hand froze over her chess piece. Protocol Artemis. The same name as the shell company. "Tell me everything," she said quietly. Bradford's story confirmed her worst fears. This wasn't just about money. Her daughters had helped create a systematic process for identifying wealthy targets, manufacturing evidence of mental illness, and facilitating their commitments, all while profiting from both the stolen assets and their investment in the facilities. Back in her room that night, Catherine added a new section to her evidence. File, Protocol Artemis, systematic criminal enterprise. The stakes had grown far beyond her own freedom. She was now sitting on evidence of organized crime masquerading as medical care. Through her bathroom window, she could see Jennifer's car pulling into the parking lot for an unexpected evening visit. Catherine smiled grimly as she hid her documents. Let them come. Let them think their plan was working. They had no idea that every move they made now only added to the evidence that would destroy them. Tomorrow, the State Medical Board investigator would arrive. But Catherine had an even bigger card to play. The FBI agent posing as a new orderly had been collecting evidence for weeks. The trap was almost ready to spring. The morning brought an unexpected visitor to Oakwood. Through her room's window, Catherine watched a sleek black Mercedes pull into the reserved parking space next to Dr. Marcus's car. The man who stepped out carried himself with the unmistakable authority of someone used to wielding power. Hospital board member James Morrison had arrived unannounced. Catherine observed the ripple of tension his presence created. Staff members suddenly became more alert. Dr. Marcus's usual smooth confidence showed cracks, and even Administrator Morton seemed unsettled during her rounds. During group therapy, Morrison sat in, ostensibly observing Dr. Marcus's techniques. But Catherine caught his sharp glances, the way his eyes lingered on certain patients. He wasn't here to observe therapy. He was gathering intelligence. The opportunity came during afternoon recreation. Morrison approached her chess table, taking the seat across from her as orderlies hovered nervously nearby. "Mrs. Wells," he said quietly, moving a pawn, "I believe we need to talk." Catherine studied the board, keeping her voice equally low. About what, Mr. Morrison? The weather, the quality of care, or perhaps about Protocol Artemis? His hand froze over a chess piece. How do you know that name? I know many things, Catherine replied, capturing his bishop, including why you're really here. The State Medical Board investigation isn't just about Oakwood, is it? Your other facilities are under scrutiny too. Morrison leaned back, reassessing her with new respect. You're nothing like what your daughters described. My daughters, Catherine smiled thinly, have gravely underestimated me, just as Marcus and Morton underestimated you. Explain. You're not here because you're part of their scheme. You're here because you've finally gathered enough evidence to stop it. But you need more, something concrete to tie all the pieces together. Morrison's eyes narrowed. Go on. I have documented evidence of systematic fraud across multiple facilities. Financial records, witness statements, proof of falsified medical documents. But more importantly, Catherine moved her queen into position. I have proof that this goes beyond simple asset theft. This is organized crime, Mr. Morrison, and you've suspected it for months. Check, she added, watching his expression. He studied the board, then her, with calculated intensity. You're right, I've been building a case. But Marcus and Morton are careful. They have political connections, powerful friends. What they don't have, Catherine countered, is 40 years of experience in corporate warfare, or a network of wealthy, wrongfully committed patients who are all willing to testify, or proof of their involvement in interstate wire fraud. Morrison's eyebrows rose. The shell companies? Artemis Health Partners is just the beginning. My daughters created an entire network of offshore entities. Every investment opportunity they offered you was designed to implicate you in their scheme. Understanding dawned in Morrison's eyes. They tried to compromise me, just like they did with every other board member who got too curious. Catherine moved another piece. Checkmate, by the way. Morrison sat back, a slow smile spreading across his face. Mrs. Wells, I think it's time we pool our resources. I have a meeting with the FBI tomorrow. I believe you should join us. Difficult given my current residential status. About that, Morrison stood, straightening his tie. As a board member, I have serious concerns about your treatment plan. I believe an immediate independent psychiatric evaluation is warranted. Perhaps by someone not connected to Dr. Marcus? Catherine allowed herself a small smile. That would be most helpful. Later that night, in her bathroom command center, Catherine updated Richard Chen. Morrison's with us. The board is split, half compromised, half suspicious. He's been gathering evidence for months. This changes everything, Chen replied. With a board member backing our claims. We move tomorrow, Catherine interrupted. Have your people ready. Once the independent evaluation clears me, we'll only have a small window before Marcus and Morton realize what's happening. She ended the call and reviewed her notebooks one final time. Morrison's arrival had accelerated her timeline, but the core plan remained the same. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the end for Oakwood's corrupt empire, and for her daughter's dreams of stealing what she'd spent a lifetime building. Dr. Marcus's morning rounds carried a different energy. Catherine could sense his unease as he stopped by her room, watching him fidget with his tablet in a way she'd never seen before. News of Morrison's independent psychiatric evaluation request had clearly disrupted his carefully controlled world. "How are you feeling today, Mrs. Wells?" he asked, trying to maintain his usual authoritative tone. "Much better, Doctor. In fact, I've been thinking quite clearly about several things. The Chicago expansion, for instance, and Artemis Health Partners." She watched the color drain from his face at the mention of Artemis. Before he could respond, an orderly appeared at the door. "Dr. Marcus, the FBI agents are here for their inspection." FBI. Marcus's composure cracked. "I was told it was a routine medical board review." Catherine smiled serenely. "Plans change, Doctor. Rather like medication protocols. Wouldn't you say? The morning unfolded like a perfectly orchestrated symphony. FBI agents interviewed staff members while routine maintenance, actually federal forensics teams, swept through the records room. Dr. Reed, seizing her moment, provided agents with detailed records of suspicious medication changes she'd been documenting for weeks. Catherine's fellow patients played their parts flawlessly. Thomas Henderson accidentally let slip about offshore accounts during his therapy session. Rebecca Ashworth had a convenient emotional breakthrough about witnessing document shredding. Diana Chen's detailed records of staff conversations proved invaluable to the investigators. By lunch, Administrator Morton's carefully maintained facade was crumbling. Catherine observed her making frantic phone calls from her office, watched through the window as she rushed to her car with boxes of files. Too late. Richard Chen's team had already copied everything through the hospital's compromised network. The real show began when Jennifer and Sarah arrived for their usual visiting hours, only to find FBI agents waiting to question them about Artemis Health Partners. Catherine, watching from the common room, saw the exact moment they realized their scheme was unraveling. "Mom," Jennifer's voice shook as she approached. "What's happening? What's happening?" Catherine replied calmly, not looking up from her crossword puzzle. "I believe it's called consequences, dear. Or did you think I wouldn't figure out your involvement in other patients' commitments?" Sarah stepped forward, desperation breaking through her professional demeanor. "You don't understand. We were trying to protect you, to protect the company, by imprisoning other people for profit." Catherine finally looked up, fixing them with the same steely gaze that had cowed countless business rivals. "I found the records, girls. Every wrongful commitment, every stolen fortune. Did you really think your mother wouldn't notice a pattern?" Before they could respond, Morrison appeared with 2 FBI agents. Ms. Wells," he nodded to Jennifer and Sarah. "I believe these agents have some questions about certain offshore transactions." As her daughters were led away, Catherine returned to her crossword. Years of business negotiations had taught her the power of a dignified exit. Let them see their mother calm and collected while their world collapsed. The afternoon brought a cascade of developments. Dr. Marcus was escorted, out in handcuffs after trying to delete patient records. Morton's attempt to flee was thwarted at the airport. Klein, the pharmacist, turned state's evidence within hours of questioning. In her room that evening, Catherine finally allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction as she packed her few belongings. The independent psychiatric evaluation had come back clean, as expected. Her release papers were being processed. Through her window, she watched FBI agents loading boxes of evidence into vans. Her daughter's Mercedes still sat in the parking lot, now sporting seizure notices on the windshields. Their attempt to steal her fortune had cost them everything: their reputations, their careers, and quite possibly their freedom. "Mrs. Wells," Lauren appeared at her door. "Your car is here, and Mr. Chen asked me to give you this." Catherine opened the envelope to find copies of emergency board resolutions, removing Jennifer and Sarah from all company positions and freezing their assets. The system they'd tried to use against her had become their prison instead. As she gathered her things, Catherine paused at the room's threshold. In just a few weeks, she'd brought down an entire criminal enterprise from within its own walls. Not bad for a supposedly unstable old woman. Now it was time to go home and rebuild. Not just her company, but the lives of all the other families destroyed by Oakwood's corrupt scheme. She'd make sure justice was served for all of them. The next 48 hours at Oakwood transformed the facility into ground zero of a federal investigation. Catherine, now technically free to leave but choosing to stay to assist investigators, watched the dominoes fall one by one from her strategic position in the common room. FBI agents had set up a command center in the hospital's conference room. Through the glass walls, she could see them interviewing staff members, many of whom were suddenly eager to talk. The night janitor revealed hidden cameras in patient rooms, A billing clerk produced years of falsified insurance claims. Even the cafeteria manager had evidence of kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies. Mrs. Wells, Agent Roberts, the lead investigator, approached her chess table. "We need to discuss the Artemis Health Partners documentation." Catherine retrieved her hidden notebooks from their various locations around the facility. 3 weeks of meticulous observation and evidence gathering, all pointing to a conspiracy larger than even the FBI had suspected. "Your daughter's involvement goes deeper than we thought," Roberts said, reviewing the records. "They didn't just participate in the scheme, they helped design it. We found similar operations in 3 other states, all using the same protocol." Catherine nodded grimly. "Follow the money through their shell companies. They created a franchise model for fraud. Each facility pays licensing fees to use the Artemis protocol." The pressure mounted as more evidence emerged. Dr. Reed, now fully cooperating with authorities, provided detailed records of medication protocols designed to keep patients compliant during asset transfers. Lauren had documented every instance of mail tampering and communication monitoring. Even Kevin, the young orderly, contributed proof of forged signatures on legal documents. Catherine's legal team, led by Michael Chang, arrived with a stack of emergency court orders. "We're freezing everything," he informed her. "Not just your daughter's assets, but all associated accounts." The judge was particularly interested in the offshore transfers. Through it all, Catherine maintained her calm demeanor, but inside, her heart ached. Not for her daughter's fate, they'd chosen their path, but for the other families destroyed by their greed. Thomas Henderson's children, who'd nearly lost their inheritance. Rebecca Ashworth's family, almost torn apart by false accusations. Diana Chen's father, still recovering from forced medication. "Mrs. Wells," Agent Roberts returned late that afternoon. "We've discovered something disturbing. Your daughters. Emails suggest they were planning to expand the operation. They had a list of potential targets, wealthy individuals marked for similar commitments." Catherine's blood ran cold as she reviewed the list. Names she recognized from Manhattan's business elite, people she'd worked with, competed against, respected, all marked for destruction by her own daughters. "There's something else," Roberts continued. "We found evidence that Dr. Marcus was planning to transfer you to a more restricted facility, one where outside communication would be impossible." The implications were clear. Once they'd secured her assets, she would have disappeared entirely. The thought sent a chill down her spine, but it also strengthened her resolve. In her room that evening, Catherine methodically organized the remaining evidence. Tomorrow, the state attorney general would arrive. Criminal charges would be filed. Lives would be forever changed. Through her window, she watched FBI agents escort Dr. Klein from the pharmacy in handcuffs. He'd cracked under questioning, revealing a sophisticated system of drug protocols designed to maintain patient compliance while avoiding detection in routine blood tests. Her phone buzzed with a message from Richard Chen. "Board meeting tomorrow. Emergency succession planning. Your daughter's collaborators are falling like dominoes." Catherine allowed herself a small smile. The pressure wasn't just mounting. It was crushing the entire corrupt system, and somewhere in a federal holding cell, her daughters were learning a harsh lesson about underestimating their mother. The morning of the emergency board meeting dawned with an atmosphere of impending reckoning. Catherine stood in her penthouse apartment for the first time in weeks, looking out over the Manhattan skyline she'd helped shape. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Reporters, investigators, lawyers, all wanting statements about the emerging Oakwood scandal. Headlines scrolled across her tablet. "Psychiatric hospital scheme exposed. Wealthy patients held for profit. High society sisters behind medical fraud ring." The story had broken wide open, sending shockwaves through New York's elite circles. "The SEC is involved now," Michael Chang reported as they rode the elevator to the Wells corporate offices. They're particularly interested in how your daughters manipulated company stock during their takeover attempt. And the other patients? Catherine asked, straightening her suit jacket, armor for the battle ahead. Being released as we speak. Thomas Henderson has already been reunited with his family. Diana Chen's father is filing a class action lawsuit. The Ashworths are cooperating with federal prosecutors. The boardroom fell silent as Catherine entered. Empty chairs marked where her daughters should have been sitting. Their allies on the board shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. They'd all received copies of the evidence, proof of their complicity, whether through action or willful ignorance. Before we begin, Catherine's voice cut through the tension. I want to be clear about what happens next. Those of you who helped, my daughters, who looked the other way while they built their criminal enterprise, have a choice to make. Resign now, cooperate with authorities, and you might salvage something from this wreckage. Stay and face the consequences. 3 board members stood immediately, placing their resignations on the table. Smart ones, Catherine noted. The others would learn the hard way. Her phone buzzed with an urgent message from Agent Roberts. Your daughters are asking to speak with you. Say they have information to trade. Catherine allowed herself a thin smile. Of course they did. Now that their scheme had collapsed, they were looking for leverage, for a way out. But they'd forgotten who taught them about negotiation in the first place. The day unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of justice. State investigators raided Oakwood's sister facilities across 3 states. Dr. Marcus's overseas accounts were frozen. Administrator Morton's political connections abandoned her as evidence of kickbacks emerged. Mrs. Wells, her assistant, interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Reed is here. The young resident entered, looking both professional and contrite. I've given my full statement to the FBI, she said without preamble. Everything I saw, every suspicious prescription, every altered record. But I wanted to tell you personally, I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner. Catherine studied the young doctor. You did speak up in the end. That's what matters. And now you can help make sure this never happens again. By afternoon, the dominoes were falling faster. The hospital board was in emergency session. Medical licenses were being suspended. Catherine's evidence had triggered investigations at private psychiatric facilities nationwide. Your daughter's lawyers are calling again, Michael Chang reported. They're offering to reveal names, dates, bank accounts, everything about the Artemis network. Tell them it's too late, Catherine replied, reviewing the latest forensic accounting reports. We already have everything. Their only choice now is to cooperate fully or face maximum charges. As evening approached, Catherine stood in her office, watching federal agents load more boxes of evidence into their vehicles. Her phone lit up with a message from Lauren. Other patients asking to meet. They want to thank you for exposing the truth. Tomorrow, she would meet with prosecutors to ensure every victim of her daughter's scheme saw justice. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of rebuilding trust in her company and helping other families heal. But tonight, as she gathered her things to head home, Catherine allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd accomplished. From a hospital room meant to be her prison, she'd orchestrated the downfall of an entire criminal enterprise. She'd protected not just her own legacy, but the lives of countless others who might have fallen victim to the scheme. Her daughters had failed to understand a fundamental truth. Real power wasn't in schemes or manipulation. It was in the strength to stand against injustice, even when it wore the face of family. Catherine sat in the federal prosecutor's office, her posture perfect despite the early hour. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see media vans gathering outside the courthouse. In less than an hour, her daughters would face arraignment for their roles in what newspapers were calling the Oakwood conspiracy. Mrs. Wells, U.S. Attorney Sandra Martinez, spread photographs across her desk. These were taken at other facilities operated under the Artemis Protocol. Dozens of victims, millions in stolen assets. Your daughter's cooperation could help us shut down the entire network. They won't cooperate, Catherine replied, studying the faces in the photos. Not willingly. They still think they can negotiate their way out. As if on cue, the door opened. Jennifer and Sarah entered in handcuffs, their designer clothes replaced by prison jumpsuits. Their lawyers hovered anxiously behind them. "Mom," Jennifer started, her voice carrying a familiar, manipulative tone. "We can explain everything." Catherine held up her hand. "Save it. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to make sure you understand exactly what's going to happen next." She opened a file, laying out documents one by one. Complete records of every double patient you helped in prison, every dollar you stole, every life you destroyed. Did you think I wouldn't find it all? Sarah's composure cracked. "We were trying to protect the company. You were making reckless decisions by expanding into Chicago," Catherine's voice cut like steel, "or by refusing to sell to the Stevensons. The only reckless decision was believing you could outsmart me." "Mrs. Wells," Martinez interjected, "perhaps we should—" "No," Catherine stood, fixing her daughters with the same steely gaze that had cowed countless business rivals. "They need to hear this. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed everything I ever taught you about integrity, about building rather than destroying. You became the very thing I spent my life fighting against, corporate raiders who value profit over people." Jennifer's lawyer stepped forward. "We're prepared to offer full cooperation in exchange for—" "There is no exchange," Catherine interrupted. "No deals, no negotiations. You'll cooperate because it's the only way to avoid spending the next 20 years in prison. And even then, you'll never work in business or medicine again. Your medical license," she looked at Sarah. "Your law license," she turned to Jennifer. "Gone forever." The reality of their situation finally seemed to hit them. Sarah slumped in her chair, while Jennifer's carefully maintained facade crumbled. "What do you want from us?" Jennifer whispered. "The truth. All of it. Every name, every scheme, every victim. You're going to help make this right, not because I'm asking, but because it's your only choice." Catherine turned to Martinez. "They're all yours, and believe me, they'll cooperate. Because they finally understand what real power is. Not schemes and manipulation, but the strength to face consequences." As she gathered her belongings, Catherine paused at the door. "One last thing. I've established a foundation to help the families you destroyed. Every penny you stole, every asset you seized, it's all going back to the victims. Your trust funds, your properties, everything. Consider it your final lesson in business ethics." The media frenzy outside the courthouse was intense, but Catherine walked through it with characteristic grace. Reporters shouted questions about betrayal, about family drama, about corporate intrigue. But this wasn't about family drama or corporate politics. It was about justice, about protecting the vulnerable from predators who hid behind medical degrees and legal certificates. Back in her office, Catherine received update after update. Dr. Marcus pleading guilty to multiple charges, Morton facing indictment, Klein turning state's evidence, the entire Oakwood empire crumbling. A message from Richard Chen brought a satisfied smile to her face. Diana Chen's father just regained control of his company. The others are being released. You did it, Catherine. You brought down the whole system. Yes, she had. And in doing so, she taught her daughters the hardest lesson of all. The true legacy isn't measured in dollars or power, but in the lives you touch and the justice you uphold. 6 months after the Oakwood scandal broke, Catherine stood at her office window, watching the sunset paint Manhattan's skyline in shades of gold. The view was the same, but everything else had changed. The morning's headlines told the final chapter of the Oakwood story. Jennifer and Sarah Wells, along with Dr. Marcus and Administrator Morton, had received lengthy prison sentences. The FBI had uncovered similar schemes at private psychiatric facilities across the country, leading to a nationwide investigation and reform of patient protection laws. "The final restitution payments have been processed," Michael Chang reported. placing a thick folder on her desk. Every victim has been compensated. The Wells Foundation is now overseeing support services for affected families. Catherine nodded, thinking of the faces she'd come to know. Thomas Henderson, now running his tech company again, leading the charge for corporate governance reform. Diana Chen and her father, rebuilding their shipping empire with new safeguards. Against family exploitation, Rebecca Ashworth, using her experience to advocate for patient rights. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Lauren Hayes, no longer a nurse, but now Director of Patient Advocacy at the Wells Foundation, entered with Dr. Reed. The Oversight Committee approved our new protocols, Dr. Reed announced. Every private psychiatric facility in the state will have independent monitoring. No more hidden cameras, no more mail tampering, no more forced medications. And the support groups are growing, Lauren added. Families helping families, sharing resources, watching for signs of similar schemes. Catherine smiled, remembering the small acts of resistance that had grown into a movement, the quiet courage of staff members who chose truth over complicity, the strength of patients who refused to be silenced. Her phone buzzed with a message. From Richard Chen, another Artemis-style operation uncovered in California. Your foundation's legal team is already on it. The empire she'd built hadn't just survived her daughter's betrayal. It had evolved into something more meaningful. Wells Real Estate still dominated Manhattan's skyline, but now it stood for more than just profit. The Wells Foundation had become a beacon of hope for families fighting similar battles. Later that evening, Catherine visited Oakwood one last time. The facility had been transformed into a legitimate psychiatric hospital, now run by a board of medical ethics experts and patient advocates. Dr. Reed led the medical team, implementing revolutionary reforms in patient care and rights protection. As she walked the familiar halls, Catherine remembered her own time there, the quiet bathroom conferences, the secret alliances, the careful gathering of evidence. Every step had led to this moment. A nurse approached, one of the few original staff members who'd helped expose the truth. "We had a new admission today," she said quietly. "Family trying to seize control of assets, but this time we caught it. The protocols you helped design worked." Catherine nodded, satisfaction warming her chest. The system hadn't just been exposed. It had been replaced with something better. In her car, driving home through the city she'd helped build, Catherine reflected on the cost of victory. Her daughters would spend years in prison, their names forever linked to one of the largest medical fraud schemes in history. The family she'd tried to create was gone, but in its place, she'd built something larger, a legacy of protection. For others who might have fallen victim to similar schemes, her phone lit up with one final message for the day, from Agent Roberts. "Last Artemis facility shut down today. Thought you should know. You started something bigger than all of us." Back in her penthouse, Catherine poured herself a small glass of celebration scotch. On her desk lay the day's final piece of business, papers formally transferring control of her daughter's trust funds to the Victim Compensation Fund. Their last assets now turned to healing the damage they'd caused. She signed the documents with the same pen she'd used to build her empire decades ago. The same pen that had signed the papers that first day, standing in front of that dilapidated brownstone with her last $500. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more families to help, more schemes to expose, more lives to protect. But tonight, Catherine Wells allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd accomplished. She'd entered Oakwood as a prisoner and emerged as a liberator. She'd lost her daughters, but gained a greater family in the lives she'd helped save. Her empire hadn't just survived, it had found its true purpose. As night fell over Manhattan, Catherine raised her glass to the city lights. Here's to second acts, she thought. Here's to turning betrayal into blessing, imprisonment into liberation, ending into beginning. Here's to proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to be its victim.